Chief Raymond Clark had always been admired by the people of his city. To outsiders, he was the perfect example of law and order, the kind of man who could be trusted with the safety of everyone in town. He wore his uniform with pride, greeted citizens with a warm smile, and attended every community event. He was a public figure, someone who inspired confidence, but behind closed doors, Clark lived a very different life. The respect he earned was nothing more than a mask for the corruption he had long hidden. Clark's financial troubles had been growing quietly for years. He had made risky investments and lost, borrowed money he couldn't repay, and had developed a gambling habit that drained whatever little savings he had left. He had tried to keep it hidden, but the pressure was mounting. Late at night, he would sit in his office staring at unpaid bills and thinking about ways to get out of the hole he had dug himself into. That's when a thought began to take shape, a thought that would change everything. The idea seemed simple at first: rob a wealthy civilian. Clark had spent his career enforcing the law, and now he believed he could bend it to his advantage. He knew the systems, the weaknesses, and the blind spots. If anyone could pull off a robbery without being caught, it was him. At least that was what he told himself. He began to plan in secret, studying potential targets. Clark wanted someone whose wealth was visible, but whose life was not heavily guarded by outside security. He looked for patterns, learning which neighborhoods were easy to access, which houses had fewer cameras, and which citizens kept a low profile. That's when he settled on a particular home on the edge of the city. It belonged to a man named Michael Donovan. To Clark, Donovan appeared to be just another wealthy entrepreneur, someone who could afford to be careless with his security. Clark didn't know the full story, but he didn't care. All he saw was opportunity. Clark knew he couldn't do it alone. He called in a few trusted officers, men who had already crossed ethical lines in their work and owed him favors. Together, they would carry out the plan. Clark explained everything to them, making sure they understood their roles and the timing. He emphasized precision and caution, reminding them that even one mistake could bring the entire operation down. His team nodded, sharing his mix of excitement and fear. To them, it felt like a thrilling venture, something that would pay off big if executed correctly. Meanwhile, Donovan was living his life as usual. He was a careful man, observant and disciplined, but to anyone looking from the outside, he seemed ordinary. He worked long hours, kept his home neat, and spent his free time on hobbies and small community events. Clark believed Donovan's careful nature was just the routine of a wealthy man. What he didn't realize was that Donovan was much more than he appeared. He was cautious because he had a reason to be. Donovan had spent years training for situations that most people couldn't even imagine. His life was far more complicated than Clark could have guessed. As the day of the heist approached, Clark's nerves were a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He rehearsed the plan repeatedly, walking through the route in his mind, visualizing every step. He believed in his intelligence, his experience, and his understanding of law enforcement. Clark's confidence was high, almost reckless. He convinced himself that nothing could go wrong. Every officer in his team trusted him, following his instructions without question. They believed in the plan because they believed in Clark. The night before the operation, Clark couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, reviewing maps, security details, and escape routes. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. His thoughts drifted for a moment to the life he had led so far. He remembered the times he had stood in front of the public, giving speeches about integrity and justice. A small part of him felt guilty for what he was about to do, but he quickly pushed it aside. That guilt was a weakness he could not afford. By midnight, Clark had finalized every detail. He had assigned positions, planned the timing, and made contingencies. His team was ready, their uniforms hidden beneath dark clothing to avoid identification. Clark himself had chosen to stay out of the shadows, intending to oversee the operation from close enough to intervene if anything went wrong. The plan was set, and all that remained was action. As they approached Donovan's house, the city was quiet. Streetlights cast long shadows across the roads, and the occasional car passed by without noticing the small convoy moving silently. Clark felt a thrill of power, mixed with the fear of discovery. Every instinct he had as a police officer told him to be cautious, but his desire for a quick solution to his problems pushed him forward. He reminded himself that once this was over, he would be free of his debts. Everything would be solved. Inside Donovan's home, the man was awake, reading a book in his study. His life was calm, almost ordinary, and he had no reason to suspect that danger was approaching. But Donovan was not naive. He had long suspected that there were threats around him, even if he couldn't see them directly. He had installed advanced security systems, unseen cameras, and alarm mechanisms that activated instantly at any sign of intrusion. His calm demeanor was a result of years of preparation. Every action he took was deliberate, every decision measured. Clark and his team reached the perimeter of the house. The plan was simple: disable any security measures, enter quietly, and take what they came for. Clark gave the signal, and the team moved into position. They were careful, efficient, and silent, confident that their knowledge of law enforcement procedures would keep them safe. Clark felt a sense of satisfaction. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The first few minutes went as expected. Clark watched through the shadows as his team bypassed what they thought were the basic security systems. But what they didn't know was that Donovan's measures were far more sophisticated than anything they had encountered. Sensors that seemed ordinary were connected to automated locks, cameras, and silent alarms. Every step they took was being observed, recorded, and analyzed in real time. Clark signaled for the next phase, unaware that they were already being monitored. His heart raced with excitement and anticipation. He reminded himself that success was almost guaranteed. After all, they were police officers. They knew the law, the patterns of criminal activity, and the weaknesses in private security systems. Nothing could go wrong. At least that was what Clark believed. As they approached the main entrance, a faint sound of a click echoed in the dark. Clark froze for a moment, straining to hear. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it set off a ripple of doubt. He shook it off, telling himself it was nothing. He pressed forward, signaling his team to continue. They moved cautiously, confident in their training and their leader. Inside, Donovan remained calm, his eyes shifting between the book in his hands and the screens showing the live feed from his security cameras. He had seen the figures moving outside, and his mind was already calculating the response. Donovan didn't panic. He had prepared for situations like this, and he knew exactly how to handle them. He was ready. Clark could sense the tension building, a subtle shift that he couldn't quite place. His instincts, honed over years of law enforcement, whispered that something was off. But his greed and desperation overpowered his caution. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the plan. He was in control, or so he thought. The night had begun, and Clark's carefully constructed plan was set into motion. Every step he took seemed perfect, yet the foundation of his confidence rested on a misunderstanding. He believed he was robbing a civilian, a man who would be easy to intimidate and outsmart. He did not know that he had stepped into a situation far beyond his imagination. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, and Clark was completely unaware of the storm he was about to unleash. Michael Donovan's life seemed ordinary to anyone passing by. From the outside, he was just another man living in a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood. He spent his mornings jogging along the streets, greeting neighbors politely and carrying on with his work like any other professional. But beneath this calm and ordinary life was a man trained to handle situations far beyond the understanding of most people. Donovan had spent years in government service, specializing in sensitive assignments that required both intelligence and extreme caution. For this reason, his home was equipped with a level of security that most citizens could only dream of. Cameras, motion detectors, and alarm systems were all connected to a central network that monitored every inch of the property. It was quiet, invisible, and highly efficient. Most people didn't know it was there, and that was the way Donovan wanted it. He noticed small irregularities around the neighborhood from time to time, things that might seem insignificant to an ordinary observer. A car parked in a strange spot, someone walking slowly past houses multiple times, or a shadow moving in the wrong place. Donovan cataloged each observation, noting details carefully. He never overreacted, but he always prepared for the worst. His caution was second nature, built over years of experience. Meanwhile, Clark and his team were growing more confident as they moved closer to executing their plan. Clark had convinced himself that Donovan was just another rich man who would be easy to intimidate and rob. The officers moved quietly, bypassing the outer security with skill and precision. Clark watched through the darkness, feeling a rush of excitement. He thought the entire operation was unfolding exactly as he had imagined. Inside the house, Donovan sensed a disturbance almost immediately. He had trained his instincts to detect the smallest deviations from normal patterns, and something about the night felt wrong. The subtle noises outside, the unusual movement in the shadows triggered a response he had rehearsed countless times. He stayed calm, assessing the situation before making a move. Panic had no place in a man's actions when facing unknown danger. Donovan activated his internal monitoring system, which silently tracked the movements around the property. The cameras captured every detail, sending live images to his personal console. He could see Clark's team as they approached, their actions methodical but unaware of the traps waiting for them. Donovan knew that he needed to act, but he also knew that sudden moves could escalate the situation. He decided to let them approach a little closer, gathering information while remaining out of sight. Back outside, Clark directed his team carefully. They thought they were in control, and Clark's confidence was bolstered by his years of law enforcement experience. He reminded his officers to stay silent and to follow instructions exactly. Every step was timed perfectly, every move calculated. Clark believed he had planned for every possible complication. What he didn't realize was that the most important factor, Donovan himself, was entirely unpredictable. As the team moved to the next phase of their plan, Donovan's preparations became clear. He had multiple layers of security, each designed to slow down or stop intruders without immediately alerting them to his presence. Motion sensors in the yard detected movement. Silent alarms triggered locking mechanisms, and hidden cameras tracked the intruders' every step. Donovan remained inside, observing everything, anticipating their next moves. His calm demeanor masked the intense focus and mental calculation going on behind his eyes. Clark signaled for his team to proceed to the main entrance. He believed that once they reached the door, the rest would be simple. Donovan, however, had prepared for this scenario. He had reinforced the entry points and installed mechanisms that would delay any attempt to break in. As the officers approached, they found that the doors were more resistant than expected, and their tools were less effective against the reinforced systems. Clark's confidence began to waver slightly, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. He could not afford to doubt himself now. Inside the house, Donovan's eyes moved swiftly between the monitors, noting the behavior of each intruder. He identified Clark immediately as the leader, someone whose presence commanded authority. Donovan also recognized that these were trained officers, not ordinary criminals. Their skill level meant that he needed to approach the situation carefully, avoiding direct confrontation while preparing to neutralize the threat effectively. Every detail mattered. One wrong move could lead to disaster. Clark's team started to feel the tension. The doors were harder to open than expected, and their movements were being tracked. The officers whispered among themselves, trying to stay calm while executing the plan. Clark reassured them. Though his own voice carried a hint of nervousness he tried to hide. He reminded them that their training gave them an advantage and that success was within reach. Still, an uneasy feeling began to creep in, the faintest shadow of doubt that perhaps things were not as straightforward as they seemed. Donovan decided it was time to prepare for a more direct intervention. While he had avoided confrontation so far, he now activated systems that would contain the intruders if necessary. Electrically locked doors, reinforced barriers, and automated alerts would give him time to confront the intruders on his terms. He also ensured that every movement was recorded, creating an irrefutable record of their actions. Donovan's focus was unshakable. He was fully aware of the potential danger, yet he maintained complete control over the environment. Clark's team finally managed to make a small breach in the outer security. They entered cautiously, moving through the house with calculated steps. The interior was unfamiliar and more fortified than they had expected. The lights were dim, shadows played tricks on their eyes, and the house seemed to respond to their presence. Clark tried to maintain his composure, giving orders and directing his team, but an edge of fear began to show. He could feel that they were being observed more closely than anticipated. Inside, Donovan remained composed, watching the intruders navigate his home. He did not intervene immediately, but instead allowed them to move into positions where he could control the situation. He analyzed their behavior, noting their strengths and weaknesses. Donovan understood that rushing in recklessly could escalate into violence, something he was determined to avoid. Patience and precision would be his allies in this confrontation. Clark's confidence was slowly eroding. The plan that had seemed foolproof now felt uncertain. The subtle resistance of the house, the unanticipated difficulties, and the eerie feeling of being watched began to gnaw at him. He tried to maintain authority, but he could sense his team's growing unease. Each officer relied on his leadership, and now that confidence was starting to falter. Despite the tension, Clark pushed forward. He reminded himself that they were law enforcement officers, skilled and trained. The home should not have been able to resist them so effectively. He felt a flicker of frustration, tempered by the knowledge that retreat was not an option. The operation had begun and there was no turning back. Clark's mind raced, weighing possibilities, calculating contingencies, and hoping that the next move would bring success. Donovan, aware of every thought and action, prepared the final layer of his response. He knew the intruders would eventually realize they were dealing with someone far more capable than they had assumed. When that moment came, he would act decisively, ensuring their containment and preventing harm to himself or the property. His preparation was meticulous, his timing flawless, and his calm, almost serene demeanor gave nothing away. The night stretched on, a tense balance between anticipation and action. Clark and his team moved carefully, each step measured, each decision critical. Donovan remained a silent observer, the master of the environment, ready to turn the situation in his favor. Both sides understood the stakes, though Clark could not yet comprehend the full scale of what he was up against. Every movement, every choice, every step in the darkened house brought them closer to a confrontation that none of them could fully predict. Clark believed he was in control, but Donovan's unseen vigilance meant that the balance of power was far from certain. As the hours passed, the tension escalated, each moment building toward an outcome that would be decisive and irreversible. Clark had no idea that his perception of the target was completely wrong, and that the consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. Clark could feel the night closing in around him, the tension thickening with every step he took. He had thought the heist would be straightforward, a simple matter of entering the house, collecting the valuables, and leaving without leaving a trace. Now every instinct in his body screamed that something was wrong, yet he refused to admit it openly, pushing the feeling aside and focusing on the plan he had crafted so carefully. The team moved cautiously through Donovan's home, their flashlights sweeping across the walls, furniture, and hallways. Every corner seemed darker than it should be, every shadow longer. Clark tried to maintain authority, issuing quiet commands to his officers, but the subtle unease in their movements betrayed their growing anxiety. It was almost as if the house itself resisted their presence. Inside the study, Donovan watched silently. His eyes were fixed on the monitors showing the intruders' every move. He had anticipated their entry points, the paths they would take, and even the mistakes they would make. Donovan had set up multiple layers of containment, and now he waited for the moment when he could act decisively. He did not need to confront them immediately. He simply needed to ensure they stayed within his calculated boundaries. Clark's team reached the first locked door. It was heavier than they expected, and their tools struggled against the reinforced frame. A bead of sweat formed on Clark's brow as he applied pressure, trying not to show frustration. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed in the silence, and every creak seemed to amplify the tension. Clark's confidence wavered for a brief moment, but he reminded himself of his authority and pushed forward, determined to succeed. As they forced the door open, a silent alarm triggered. Clark did not notice it immediately, but Donovan's system had already responded. Doors began to lock in a sequence, creating barriers that would slow down or trap intruders. The officers found themselves navigating an environment that was far more complex than they had expected. Clark's careful planning began to crumble under the weight of the unknown, and unease spread through the team. Donovan watched with a calm intensity. He had anticipated the intruders' reactions and had positioned his automated defenses accordingly. Every movement they made played into his calculations, and every misstep tightened the control he held over the situation. His patience was deliberate. He did not need to rush. He simply observed, allowed them to make mistakes, and prepared to respond when the timing was perfect. Clark signaled for his team to regroup, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their flashlights. He could sense the fear beginning to creep in, a subtle undercurrent that threatened to undermine their coordination. Clark's voice was steady, but inside his mind raced with contingency plans. He reminded himself that they were law enforcement officers, trained and skilled, and that they could overcome unexpected obstacles. Yet the house seemed to resist their every move. The team advanced further, entering the main hallway. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the air felt heavier as if it carried an unseen weight. Clark's instincts, honed through years of law enforcement, screamed at him that they were being watched. Every creak, every faint noise, every flicker of movement made his heart beat faster. He clenched his jaw and continued, forcing himself to maintain control. Suddenly, one of the officers froze. A door that had appeared to be open had closed silently behind them, trapping him momentarily. Clark moved quickly, checking the mechanism, realizing that Donovan's system had locked the door automatically. The team began to feel the environment shift around them, their movements no longer entirely under their control. Clark's authority was challenged, not by another human, but by a man they could not see and a system they could not understand. Donovan's mind worked rapidly. He had calculated every possible escape route, every potential action the intruders could take. He knew exactly how to contain them without direct confrontation. The silent alarms, the locking doors, and the monitored cameras were all part of a larger plan. Donovan understood that patience and precision were his greatest tools. He could allow the intruders to move, but only where he had prepared for them. Clark realized that something had gone terribly wrong. The house was no longer just a setting for the heist. It had become an opponent. Every move they made was anticipated, and every barrier seemed deliberate. Clark's earlier confidence began to erode, replaced by a gnawing fear that he could not ignore. The officers looked to him for guidance, and he struggled to maintain a calm exterior. Even as uncertainty took hold, the intruders attempted to push forward, but each hallway, each doorway seemed to become more complex. Clark's careful planning had not accounted for a target with such advanced preparation. The subtle traps, the silent locks, and the precision of Donovan's systems turned a simple heist into a maze. Clark's mind raced, trying to find a solution, but every option seemed riskier than the last. Inside, Donovan adjusted his monitoring, observing the team's reactions closely. He saw the fear and confusion beginning to take hold, and he knew the moment was approaching when he could act decisively. He did not rush. He remained calm, poised, and patient, allowing the intruders to reach the points he had anticipated. Every step they took brought them closer to containment, and every mistake only reinforced his advantage. Clark tried to communicate with his team, but the usual coordination and trust seemed to falter under the growing tension. The officers moved more cautiously, their fear apparent in the way they handled their equipment and glanced at the darkened corners. Clark clenched his fists, trying to project authority and confidence, but the cracks in his demeanor were visible. The situation was no longer under his control. The first real confrontation was subtle. A sensor near the stairway triggered a non-lethal deterrent, temporarily disorienting one of the officers. Clark rushed to help, but in doing so, he triggered another mechanism, a lockdown of the hallway they were about to enter. The house now actively impeded their progress, not with violence, but with precise and calculated obstacles. Clark's frustration grew, but he could not act recklessly. Every step was being monitored, and any mistake could be catastrophic. Donovan's presence was invisible yet undeniable. He was the silent force controlling every aspect of the home, using intelligence and preparation rather than brute strength. Clark could not see him, could not anticipate his next move, and could not rely on conventional strategies. The intruders were trapped not by physical barriers alone, but by the meticulous planning and foresight of their target. Clark took a deep breath and attempted to regain control. He reminded his team that they were trained professionals, that they had faced difficult situations before. Yet the house itself seemed alive with calculated resistance, and the officers were beginning to realize that they were not dealing with an ordinary target. Every move forward required careful thought, and even then the outcome was uncertain. As the night continued, Clark's confidence further diminished. The realization began to settle in that Donovan was far more than a wealthy civilian. The systems, the precision, and the patience all pointed to someone with skills and training far beyond what they had expected. Clark's mind raced with possibilities, trying to assess who or what they were up against. Yet the answer remained elusive, hidden behind the calm and controlled presence of Donovan. Donovan watched silently, waiting for the moment when action would be necessary. He had prepared for every contingency, anticipating mistakes and exploiting weaknesses. Clark and his team were skilled, but their skills were conventional, limited to predictable patterns. Donovan operated on a different level, using patience, observation, and calculated response. The house was his ally, his tools, and his advantage. Clark finally realized that the heist had turned into a dangerous trap. The initial excitement and confidence were replaced by uncertainty and fear. He tried to rally his team, but even the strongest officers could sense the change in dynamics. The house was no longer a passive environment. It was an active participant, controlled by someone far more capable than themselves. Every step forward carried risk, and every miscalculation could have severe consequences. The night had become a test of patience, intelligence, and adaptability. Clark and his team moved cautiously, each step measured and deliberate, while Donovan observed silently, calculating his next move. The tension was palpable, a quiet storm building between the intruders and the unseen master of the house. Clark could feel the shift in power, the realization that they were not in control. The heist, once seemingly simple, had become a challenge unlike any they had faced, and the outcome was far from certain. Clark's heart raced as he realized the heist was no longer going according to plan. Every step the team took seemed to trigger a new obstacle. Doors locked unexpectedly, corridors narrowed, and surveillance systems tracked them relentlessly. The officers began whispering among themselves, voices tense and cautious. Clark tried to project calm authority, but inside a storm of fear and confusion raged. The certainty he had felt earlier had vanished entirely. Inside, Donovan observed everything with precise focus. He knew the intruders were skilled, but their movements revealed hesitation, frustration, and fear. He had predicted this. His patience was deliberate, allowing them to advance into positions where he could control the situation completely. Donovan's calm presence was in sharp contrast to the officers' growing panic. He did not move from his post but monitored their every action, preparing to respond at the exact moment it was necessary. Clark motioned for his team to spread out and check for potential valuables. The officers moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the dimly lit rooms, their hands hovering near their tools. Clark followed, trying to maintain a semblance of control. He could feel that they were being watched, but he could not identify the source. Every instinct he had as a police officer screamed that something was wrong, but he forced himself to continue, clinging to the hope that the plan could still succeed. Suddenly, one of the officers triggered a sensor near the back staircase. A soft click echoed and the hallway behind them sealed shut. Clark rushed to the barrier, testing the mechanism, but it held firm. Panic began to rise within the team. Clark's voice remained steady, but the subtle tremor in his tone betrayed his concern. He realized that they were no longer simply intruding into a house. They were moving through a controlled environment designed to manipulate their actions. Donovan prepared his next move carefully. He activated the internal lockdown sequence, ensuring that every potential exit the intruders might consider was secured. He did not need to confront them physically. The house itself was a tool for containment. He reviewed the live feeds, noting the position of each officer, and calculated the best way to neutralize the threat without endangering anyone unnecessarily. Donovan understood that his advantage lay not in force but in preparation and observation. Clark's team attempted to push forward, but the environment resisted. Hallways seemed to stretch longer than they should. Doors that had been open moments ago were now sealed, and subtle mechanical barriers slowed their progress. The officers exchanged anxious glances, their confidence waning. Clark knew he needed to regain control, but every move seemed to be anticipated. The realization that they were dealing with an extraordinary opponent began to sink in. As the tension grew, Clark noticed subtle signs that they were being recorded. Cameras hidden behind walls, sensors embedded in corners, and reflective surfaces that caught their movements all pointed to surveillance beyond ordinary security measures. Clark's mind raced, trying to assess the situation. Could the target be more than just a wealthy civilian? His previous assumptions began to crumble, replaced by a creeping suspicion that they had misjudged the entire scenario. Donovan decided it was time to reveal himself. He did not rush in. Instead, he spoke through the intercom system, his calm, measured voice filling the house. "Chief Clark, I know who you are and what you are attempting," he said. The officers froze, their eyes wide in shock. Clark felt a jolt of disbelief. How could this man know so much about them? The calm authority in Donovan's voice was unnerving, leaving no room for argument. Clark tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He realized that the situation had escalated beyond control. Donovan continued, outlining their actions with precision, naming each officer and describing their movements. It became immediately clear that Donovan had complete knowledge of the heist, and that their every step had been anticipated. Clark's confidence collapsed as the full extent of Donovan's preparation became apparent. Donovan revealed his true identity. He was not the ordinary civilian Clark had assumed. He was a government operative, trained to handle threats, gather intelligence, and neutralize dangers efficiently. Clark had unknowingly targeted someone with skills far beyond his own, and now the consequences of that misjudgment were unavoidable. The officers stood in stunned silence, realizing that their leader had underestimated the situation entirely. Clark tried to regain composure, issuing instructions to continue the plan, but the officers hesitated. They were caught between loyalty to their chief and the undeniable reality that they were outmatched. Every potential action seemed fraught with risk. Clark's mind raced, considering options, but Donovan's calm observation made it impossible to act without immediate consequences. The environment controlled by Donovan's systems limited their freedom and increased the pressure. Donovan instructed the team to remain in place. The doors and corridors, already locked, ensured that they could not escape easily. He began to engage with Clark directly, speaking about the risks and consequences of his actions. Clark felt a surge of panic. The plan that had seemed so certain was now unraveling before his eyes. He realized that not only had he underestimated Donovan, but he had also underestimated the consequences of his own corruption. The officers, seeing the situation clearly for the first time, began to voice concerns. Clark attempted to assert authority, but his words lacked the power they once held. The team was aware that their options were limited, and that further aggression could lead to immediate capture. Clark's usual confidence, built over years of law enforcement experience, was now overshadowed by fear and uncertainty. Donovan's strategy was deliberate and measured. He did not need to use force. His preparations and the systems in the house had already neutralized the threat. Clark and his team were contained, and every action they attempted only reinforced Donovan's advantage. The calm, controlled presence of Donovan contrasted sharply with the tension and fear among the intruders. It became clear that the outcome was inevitable, and resistance was futile. Clark attempted to negotiate, speaking quickly and urgently, but Donovan remained unshaken. He outlined the legal and personal consequences of their actions, emphasizing that the evidence was irrefutable. Clark's attempts to reason were met with a patient, unwavering response. The officers began to understand that the situation was no longer a matter of physical confrontation, but one of accountability and consequence. As the minutes passed, Clark's confidence eroded further. The realization that their heist had failed completely became undeniable. Donovan's calm authority and meticulous planning had turned the situation entirely in his favor. The intruders were trapped, exposed, and powerless. Every attempt to regain control was anticipated and countered with precision. Clark's mind raced, struggling to find a path forward, but the options were disappearing rapidly. Donovan instructed Clark and his team to remain where they were until authorities arrived. He contacted the appropriate agencies, ensuring that the arrest would be carried out efficiently and safely. Clark could do nothing but comply, his earlier arrogance replaced by a growing sense of dread. The team remained silent, aware that their actions had been thoroughly documented and that escape or resistance was impossible. The final moments before the arrival of federal agents were tense. Clark and his officers sat quietly, surrounded by the technology and traps that had neutralized them. Donovan remained calm, observing without haste, ensuring that the situation remained under control. Clark reflected on his choices, realizing that his greed and arrogance had led him into a trap from which there was no escape. The contrast between his previous confidence and his current helplessness was stark and undeniable. When the agents arrived, Clark and his team were taken into custody without incident. The arrest was swift, efficient, and documented thoroughly. Clark felt a mix of shame, fear, and disbelief. The consequences of his actions were now unavoidable, and there was no one to blame but himself. Donovan's careful planning and calm execution had ensured that justice was served without violence or chaos. As Clark and the officers were led away, Donovan returned to his quiet observation. The house, once a site of tension and uncertainty, returned to calm. Donovan reflected on the events, aware of the risks and the skill required to handle the situation effectively. The night had tested every measure of preparation, patience, and intelligence, and it had been navigated successfully. Clark's heist had failed, and the consequences were immediate and irreversible. The story of the failed heist would later become a lesson in hubris, preparation, and the consequences of corruption. Clark's downfall was swift, and Donovan's role remained largely hidden to the public. The contrast between reckless ambition and careful, deliberate planning had been starkly demonstrated. Clark's confidence had been shattered, and Donovan's calm expertise had ensured that justice prevailed without violence. The night ended with a sense of resolution, the events leaving a lasting impact on all involved. Clark sat in the back of the federal agent's vehicle, handcuffed and quiet. The adrenaline that had driven him through the night's events had faded, leaving only a heavy weight of reality pressing down on him. The confidence he had held just hours earlier was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of failure and the bitter taste of consequence. He had underestimated his target, misjudged his abilities, and ignored the very instincts that had guided him for years in law enforcement. Now he faced the results of his own hubris. His team, also in custody, shared his grim realization. They had followed Clark's orders, trusting his judgment, and now they were caught in the full weight of accountability. Fear and shame mingled in their expressions. The adrenaline had subsided, leaving them raw and exposed. Each officer understood in that quiet moment that their careers, reputations, and freedom were all on the line. The mistakes that had once seemed manageable now loomed large and irreversible. Meanwhile, Donovan had returned to his home, settling into the calm after the storm. He checked the surveillance feeds one last time, ensuring that everything was secure and that there were no lingering threats. The house, once a battlefield of tension and uncertainty, returned to its quiet state. Donovan allowed himself a moment of reflection. The night had tested his skills, patience, and ability to remain calm under pressure. He had prevailed not through force but through preparation, intelligence, and careful observation. Clark could only imagine the man he had underestimated. Every detail of Donovan's preparation was beyond comprehension. The traps, the surveillance, the calm authority. Clark realized that he had been outmatched at every turn. The humiliation of being outsmarted by someone he thought was an ordinary civilian cut deeply. For the first time in his life, Clark felt powerless, his usual dominance stripped away. The legal proceedings that followed were swift. Federal authorities documented every aspect of the heist attempt, using the evidence Donovan had gathered to ensure an airtight case. Clark and his team faced charges not only for attempted robbery, but also for corruption, abuse of authority, and other crimes uncovered during the investigation. The courts moved quickly, and the media coverage was relentless. The city's police chief, once a figure of respect, was now a public symbol of corruption and failure.